A soul is a heavy thing to wager on the turn of a card, yet in the shadows of London, it weighed less than a gold sovereign to a desperate man. London, 1823. The air inside the Crimson Rook gaming hell was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, spilled claret, and the copper tang of fear. It was a place where fortunes were not just lost, but devoured, where the desperation of the fallen aristocracy met the predatory greed of the rising merchant class. In the centre of the main salon, beneath the haze of smoke that drifted lazily toward the soot-stained ceiling, a single table commanded the attention of the room. The silence around it was unnatural, broken only by the snap of pasteboard and the ragged, shallow breathing of the young man seated at the south position. Viscount Rupert Vance looked as though he were facing a firing squad rather than a game of piquet. At 22, he should have been in the prime of his youth, but the candlelight revealed a face gaunt with exhaustion, his cravat loosened in a display of slovenliness that would have horrified his late father. His hands trembled as he reached for his glass, finding it empty for the third time that hour. Across from him sat Baron Oswald Finch, a man who resembled a toad that had been dressed in purple velvet by a blind tailor. Finch was obese, his neck spilling over his collar, his watery eyes gleaming with a malice that went far beyond the game. He did not play for money. He played for the ruin of better men. Watching from the shadows near the heavy oak door, invisible to the players engrossed in their own destruction, stood Gideon Althorpe, the Duke of Rothmore. Gideon was a man carved from granite and ice, his presence commanding silence even when he did not speak. He was 32, in the fullness of his power, with ink-black hair cropped short in the military style and a face that seemed incapable of smiling. His eyes were his most arresting feature, a deep, dark navy blue that held no warmth, only a piercing, analytical intelligence. He was not here to gamble. He despised the vice. He was here because he had been hunting Oswald Finch for 6 months. Gideon knew Finch was running a fraudulent railway scheme, draining the coffers of widows and foolish investors. But knowledge was not proof. He needed documents. He needed a witness. He needed the physical evidence that would send the Baron to Newgate Prison. Until he had it, he could only watch, a silent sentinel in the dark, waiting for Finch to make a mistake. He had not expected to witness a slaughter. At the table, the game had reached its crisis. "I have nothing left," Rupert whispered, his voice cracking. The pile of markers in front of Finch was obscene, representing the entirety of the Vance estate, the London townhouse, the horses, and the family silver. Rupert had lost it all in a span of 3 hours, driven by a madness that Gideon had seen in too many men who believed luck owed them a living. "Come now, Lord Vance," Finch purred, his voice oily and thick. "A gentleman always has something of value. You have a name. You have a legacy. And if the rumours are true, you have a sister." Gideon's jaw tightened. He shifted slightly in the shadows, his gloved hand closing into a fist. He knew of the Vance family. The old Viscount had been a man of honour, but his son was a weakling. And the daughter, Gideon recalled seeing her once from a distance, a figure of dignity in a worn cloak, trying to manage her brother's chaotic affairs. Rupert paled, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit that did not exist. "You cannot speak of Helena here. She is a lady. She is a spinster of 25 with no dowry, and a brother who has gambled away the roof over her head." Finch countered brutally, leaning forward. The velvet of his coat strained against his bulk. "Who will take her? Who will feed her when you are in debtor's prison tomorrow? I offer you a chance, Rupert. One final hand. Against the debt. All of it. The house, the land, the markers." "And the wager?" Rupert asked, his voice barely a breath. "Your sister's hand in marriage," Finch said, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. "Or should she refuse the honour of being a baroness, her services as my companion? Either way, she comes to my house." The room seemed to stop breathing. Even the hardened gamblers at the neighbouring tables paused, sensing that a line of decency had been crossed. To wager a woman was not unheard of in the darkest corners of the city, but to wager a gentlewoman, a viscount's daughter, against a pile of debt was an obscenity. Rupert looked at the cards in his hand. He looked at the mountain of debt that would crush him by sunrise. He was a coward, and fear made monsters of weak men. "Done," Rupert whispered. "No," Gideon said, though the word was spoken only in his mind. He took a step forward, ready to intervene, but the cards were already on the table. Rupert laid down his hand with a trembling flourish. A strong hand, kings and queens. For a second, hope flared in the boy's eyes. Then Finch laughed, a wet, wheezing sound. "A valiant effort, my boy, but not enough." Finch spread his cards. Aces. A perfect run. It was impossible, statistically absurd, but undeniable. Gideon's sharp eyes caught the slight, unnatural movement of Finch's thumb over the edge of the card. A mechanic's shift. He was cheating. Gideon knew it with the certainty of a man who had survived the war, but he had no proof. If he called it out now, Finch would demand a duel, and while Gideon would win a duel, the scandal would destroy Miss Vance's reputation irrevocably before the sun rose. A woman whose brother bet her in a gambling hell was already damaged. A woman whose honour caused a duel in a gambling hell was ruined forever. Rupert stared at the cards, his face draining of blood, until he looked like a corpse. He slumped back in his chair, covering his face with his hands. Finch stood up, scraping his heavy chair against the floor. He began to gather the markers, his eyes gleaming with lust and triumph. "I shall collect the deed to the estate tomorrow. As for the girl, I believe I shall collect her tonight. My carriage is outside. I will go to your house and inform her of her change in circumstances. That will not be necessary." The voice cut through the room like a whip crack. Gideon stepped out of the shadows, the candlelight catching the silver buttons of his charcoal coat. The crowd parted instantly. A duke did not frequent such places, and a duke like Rothmore, known for his severity and his immense political power, was a terrifying sight to men with guilty consciences. Finch froze, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he composed himself. He bowed, though it was shallow and disrespectful. "Your Grace, I did not know the Duke of Rothmore enjoyed the humble diversions of the Crimson Rook." "I am not here for diversion," Gideon said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He walked to the table, ignoring the weeping Rupert, and fixed his navy blue eyes on the Baron. "And I will not permit you to leave this room with that wager." Finch bristled, trying to summon the arrogance of his victory. "The boy lost, Rothmore, fair and square. The girl is mine. It is a debt of honour." "There is no honour in this room," Gideon replied. He looked down at Rupert, who was looking up at him with pathetic hope. "You are a disgrace to your title, Vance. Your father would have shot himself before allowing this." Rupert flinched as if struck, tears streaming down his face. "I had no choice. I thought I could win." Gideon turned back to Finch. "State the value of the debt." Finch narrowed his eyes. "It is not about money, Your Grace. I have a particular fondness for Miss Vance." "State the value," Gideon repeated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. £20,000, Finch lied, inflating the number by double, plus the interest. "And the girl." Gideon did not blink. He reached into his inner pocket and withdrew a leather checkbook. He uncapped a silver fountain pen and wrote with steady, sharp movements. He tore the slip of paper and slammed it onto the table. It landed on top of the aces. £30,000, Gideon said, drawn on the Bank of England. "It clears the debt, the interest, and buys the markers." Finch looked at the cheque. It was a fortune, an absolute fortune. But his obsession with Helena Vance was deep-rooted. He sneered, "I do not want your money, Rothmore. I won the prize I wanted. The girl belongs to me." Gideon took a step closer, invading the Baron's personal space. He lowered his voice so that only Finch could hear, his tone turning into pure ice. "Take the money, Oswald, or tomorrow morning I will pay a visit to the investors of the Great Northern Railway project. I will ask them why the tracks you promised in York have not yet been laid, and why the funds seem to have vanished into your personal accounts." Finch went pale. The sweat on his forehead turned cold. How do you know about that?" "I know everything," Gideon bluffed. He did not have the papers to prove it yet. but he knew enough to terrify a fraudster. Take the check, leave the girl, or I will ruin you so thoroughly that the rats in Newgate will refuse to share a cell with you. Finch looked at the Duke's navy eyes and saw his own destruction reflected in them. He looked at the cheque for £30,000. Greed warred with lust, but fear won. He snatched the cheque from the table. As you wish, Your Grace, Finch hissed, pocketing the paper. You have bought yourself a very expensive headache. The girl is proud. She will not suit you. Gideon ignored him. He turned to Rupert. Get out of my sight. But my sister, Rupert stammered. Your sister is no longer your concern, Gideon said, looking at the young man with utter contempt. You sold her. I bought the debt, technically by the laws of this hellhole you frequent. She is now my responsibility. Rupert fled the room, stumbling over his own feet. Gideon watched him go, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had saved the girl from a monster, but in doing so he had shackled himself. He could not simply send her back to her brother. Rupert would sell her again next week. And he could not leave her alone in London with Finch still at large and vengeful. Gideon signalled to the club owner, who had been watching nervously. My carriage. Now. The night air outside was brisk, carrying the scent of rain. Gideon climbed into his black carriage, the interior smelling of leather and solitude. He gave the driver the address of the Vance townhouse in Mayfair. As the horses lurched forward, Gideon leaned his head back against the squabs and closed his eyes. He was a man of logic, of precise calculations. He did not act on impulse. Yet tonight, he had spent £30,000 to acquire a woman he did not know, simply because the alternative was too vile to stomach. He told himself it was a temporary measure. He would take her to Holloway Hall, his estate in Derbyshire. He would employ her. It would give her protection and a legitimate reason to be under his roof without scandal, or at least with less scandal than being Finch's mistress. He would keep her there until he had solidified the case against Finch and sent the Baron to prison. Then he would figure out what to do with her. But deep down, a cynical voice whispered that he had just complicated his orderly life beyond measure. The Vance townhouse was a narrow, tall structure in a once fashionable street that had slowly succumbed to genteel poverty. The paint was peeling around the doorframe, and the windows were dark, save for a single light on the first floor. Gideon instructed his driver to wait. He walked up the steps and pounded the brass knocker. It took a long time for the door to open. When it did, it was not a servant who greeted him, for the Vances could no longer afford staff. It was Helena Vance herself. She held a candle in one hand, the flame illuminating her face. She was 25, but the worry lines around her eyes made her look older. Her hair, the colour of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe practical knot, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was brown merino, high-necked and well-mended, the uniform of a woman who had learned to make do, but it was her eyes that held him. They were dark brown, intelligent, and completely devoid of fear. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a soldier in the midst of a retreat. Lord Rothmore, she said, recognizing him. Her voice was calm, though he noticed her knuckles were white where she gripped the candlestick. To what do I owe this intrusion? It is past midnight. I need to speak with you, Miss Vance. It concerns your brother. A shadow of resignation passed over her face. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. The hallway was stripped bare. The paintings were gone. The rug was gone. There were crates stacked near the door. She was packing. Is he dead? She asked, leading him into a sitting room that contained only 2 chairs and a cold fireplace. She did not offer him a seat. She remained standing, placing the candle on the mantelpiece. No, Gideon said, closing the door behind him. He removed his hat but kept his gloves on. He is alive, but he has lost everything. Helena let out a short, bitter laugh. He lost everything months ago, Your Grace. If that is your news, you have wasted a journey. He lost more than money tonight, Gideon said, his voice hard. He wagered you. The silence that followed was absolute. Helena stood very still. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply stared at him. her chest rising and falling rapidly. To whom? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Baron Finch. For the first time, her composure cracked. Her hand went to her throat. Finch. The man who had been circling her like a shark for 2 years. The man who had touched her arm at the opera with clammy fingers and whispered obscenities. He won, Gideon continued, sparing her nothing. He intended to collect you tonight. Helena closed her eyes. She swayed slightly, and for a moment Gideon thought he would have to catch her, but she locked her knees and forced herself to stand upright. I see, she said. So Rupert has finally done it. He has sold me. He tried, Gideon said. I intervened. Helena opened her eyes. She looked at him, confused. You intervened? I bought the debt, Gideon stated flatly. He wanted to sound reassuring, but he knew he sounded like a businessman discussing a merger. I paid Finch £30,000. He has relinquished his claim on you. Relief washed over her face, so profound it was painful to watch, but it was quickly replaced by a new, sharper wariness. £30,000. That is a king's ransom. Why would you do that? We are not friends, Your Grace. We are barely acquaintances. I could not leave you to Finch, Gideon said. However, I am not a charity institution, Miss Vance. Helena stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. Then what are you? I have purchased your brother's debt, Gideon said, choosing his words with deliberate cruelty to make her understand the gravity of her position. By the terms of the wager, you are now the collateral. You belong to me until the debt is paid. He watched the colour drain from her face, leaving her pale as marble. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and betrayal. So I have simply changed owners. Is that it? From a toad to a wolf. I am not offering you a position as my mistress, if that is what you fear, Gideon said coldly, offended despite himself. I have need of a secretary, a private administrator. I understand you managed your father's estate before his death. I did, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Then you will work for me. You will come with me to Holloway Hall in Derbyshire. You will organise my affairs. You will work until the value of your labour equals £30,000. Helena looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. You want me to be your employee? To pay off £30,000? It would take me 3 lifetimes. Then you had best start tonight, Gideon said. You cannot stay here. Finch is a vengeful man. He has taken the money, but he will not forget the insult. He will come for you the moment my back is turned. You are not safe in London. Helena looked around the empty room, at the crates she had packed. She had planned to go to an aunt in the country, a woman who hated her. Even in desperation, she doubted the old woman would have opened the door. She had £40 to her name. She had no power, no allies, and a brother who had sold her. She looked at the Duke. He was imposing, terrifying, and cold, but he was not Oswald Finch. He was offering her a prison, yes, but a prison with high walls that might keep the monsters out. She lifted her chin, a gesture of pride that tugged at something in Gideon's chest. I have no choice, do I? She asked. No, Gideon replied. You do not. Very well, Helena said. She walked to the corner and picked up a small, battered valise. She did not look back at the house where she had been born, or the room where she had spent her childhood. She looked only at the Duke, her brown eyes burning with a fierce, cold light. I am ready. Gideon nodded. He opened the door for her. He did not offer her his arm. She did not expect it. They walked out into the London night, 2 strangers bound together by a piece of paper and a fortune in gold. Helena climbed into the carriage, sitting as far away from him as the space allowed. As the carriage jolted into motion, leaving the only life she had ever known behind, Helena stared out at the passing gaslights. She told herself she was just a transaction, a line item in a ledger. She would not cry. She would not break. She would survive this Duke and his cold navy eyes, just as she had survived everything else. Gideon sat in the darkness opposite her, watching her profile. He had told her she was an employee. He had told her it was a business arrangement. But as they rattled over the cobblestones toward the Great North Road, he knew he had lied. He had not bought a secretary. He had bought a conscience, and its weight was far heavier than the gold he had signed away. The journey to Derbyshire had begun. The heavy door of the black carriage clicked shut, sealing out the damp London air and enclosing Helena Vance in a world of leather, polished wood, and suffocating silence. Across from her sat the Duke of Rothmore, a man who had purchased her future with the stroke of a pen, yet he did not look at her. He was already engrossed in a stack of documents he had pulled from a leather case, his attention fixed on the ink and paper, as if the woman he had just uprooted from her life were nothing more than a piece of luggage secured to the roof. The carriage lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cobblestones of Mayfair, a sound that felt to Helena like the turning of a great, heavy key in a lock. She did not look back at the townhouse. There was nothing there for her anymore. Only the ghost of a father who had died too soon and the shadow of a brother who had failed her. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the passing gaslights, watching them blur into streaks of yellow against the rain-streaked glass, each one a mile marker, distancing her from the only identity she had ever known. The journey to Derbyshire was a crucible of quiet tension that stretched over 3 agonizing days. It was not merely the physical discomfort of the road, though the ruts and potholes of the Great North Road were unforgiving in the wet spring weather. It was the proximity. The carriage was spacious by ordinary standards, a testament to the Duke's wealth, but with 2 people bound by such a perverse and unspoken contract, it felt smaller than a prison cell. Gideon Althorpe was a wall of silence. For hours, the only sounds were the scratching of his pen, the rustle of parchment, and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. He worked with a relentless mechanical efficiency, reviewing parliamentary reports and estate correspondences, building a fortress of bureaucracy between himself and the woman sitting 3 feet away. Helena, possessing neither book nor needlepoint to occupy her hands, was forced to sit with her own thoughts, which were far more dangerous companions. She studied him when she thought he was not looking. His profile was severe, cut from the same hard stone as the cliffs of the north, his jaw set in a line of permanent resolve. His navy blue eyes, when he lifted them to check the light or the time, were unreadable, devoid of the predatory gleam she had seen in Baron Finch, but also devoid of any warmth. He was not cruel, she realized, as the miles rolled beneath them. He was simply absent. He had performed a duty, a transaction, and now he seemed determined to forget the human cost of it. They stopped only when necessary, at coaching inns that grew progressively more rustic the further north they travelled. These interludes were a torment of a different kind. At the first inn, near St. Albans, the landlord had looked at the ducal crest on the carriage door and bowed low enough to sweep the floor with his nose. But his eyes had darted between Gideon and Helena with knowing, salacious curiosity. A duke, travelling with a young, unchaperoned woman who wore no wedding ring and carried only a single battered valise, could mean only one thing in the eyes of the world. Helena felt the weight of those glances like physical blows. She held her head high, her spine stiffened by the pride that was her last offence, but inside she was burning with shame. Gideon seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply did not care what innkeepers and stable boys thought of him. He ordered private parlours for their meals, where they ate in a silence so thick it made the food taste like ash. He did not try to converse with her, did not ask about her comfort, did not offer pleasantries about the weather. He treated her with the polite, distant courtesy one might extend to a governess or a distant relation one was obliged to tolerate. On the second day, as the flat fields of the Midlands gave way to the rolling, rugged hills of the Peak District, the silence finally broke, if only for a moment. The carriage had hit a particularly deep rut, jarring them violently. A stack of papers slid from Gideon's lap, scattering across the floor. Instinctively, Helena reached down to gather them, her hands brushing against the expensive, heavy bond paper. "Leave them," Gideon said. The command was sharp, like the crack of a whip. Helena froze, her hand hovering over a letter. She looked up to find his navy eyes fixed on her, cold and warning. "I was merely helping, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. "I do not require help," he replied. leaning down to collect the papers himself. His movements were swift, reclaiming his property, re-establishing the boundary she had inadvertently crossed. "And you are not a servant to scramble on the floor." Helena sat back, stung. "I am not a guest either, am I? What am I then? You say I am to work off a debt, yet you treat me as if I am invisible." Gideon paused, the papers in his hand. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they had left London. He saw the fatigue etched around her dark brown eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the fraying lace on her cuffs that she tried to hide. He saw a woman who was terrified but refusing to show it, and the guilt he had been suppressing surged up, making him harsher than he intended. "You are my responsibility, Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat. "And until we reach Holloway Hall, that is all you need to be." He returned to his reading, ending the conversation as abruptly as if he had slammed a door in her face. Helena turned back to the window, biting her lip to keep it from trembling. She would not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of him. The landscape outside matched her mood, grey, wild, and unforgiving. Stone walls cut across the green hills like scars, and the wind whipped the heather into a frenzy. It was a beautiful, lonely country, a place where secrets could be buried deep in the moors and never found. They arrived at Holloway Hall on the evening of the third day. The sun had long since set, swallowed by heavy, bruising clouds, and the rain had turned into a steady, freezing downpour. The carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of wrought-iron gates that groaned in protest, rust flaking from their hinges. The drive was long and winding, lined by ancient oaks that stretched their skeletal branches over the path, creating a tunnel of darkness. When the house finally emerged from the gloom, Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Holloway Hall was immense, a sprawling Jacobean structure of dark stone and mullioned windows, but it felt blind. Only a few windows on the ground floor were lit. The rest of the house was shrouded in darkness, looming against the night sky like a sleeping beast. There was no army of footmen waiting with torches, no warm welcome for the returning master. It spoke of a house that was lived in, but not loved. The carriage halted before the main entrance. The driver scrambled down to open the door, and Gideon stepped out, ignoring the rain that immediately darkened the shoulders of his coat. He turned and offered a hand to Helena. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at his gloved palm, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, impersonal, steadying her as she stepped down onto the wet gravel. She shivered as the wind cut through her thin cloak. "Bennett!" Gideon barked, his voice echoing against the stone facade. The heavy front doors creaked open, and an elderly butler appeared, holding a lantern. He looked weary, his livery slightly too large for his frame, as if he had shrunk with the house. "Your Grace," Bennett said, bowing. "We did not expect you until the morrow." "We made good time," Gideon said, ushering Helena into the entrance hall. The interior of Holloway Hall was grand, with a soaring ceiling and a checkerboard marble floor that echoed their footsteps. But the air was stale, smelling of beeswax and neglect. Dust motes danced in the light of the chandelier, which held only half its candles. Shadows clung to the corners, hiding the tapestries that hung from the walls. It was a house that desperately needed a mistress, yet it felt hostile to the very idea of a woman's presence. Steps clicked sharply on the marble, rapid and authoritative. From the shadows emerged a woman who could only be the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable was a tall, angular woman in her 50s, wearing black bombazine that rustled like dry leaves. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features with it, and her eyes were small, dark beads of judgment. She stopped a few feet from them, her gaze flicking from Gideon to Helena, taking in the worn valise, the damp hem of her dress, and the utter lack of a maid or chaperone. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, dipping into a curtsy that was technically correct, but visibly stiff. "We were not informed of guests." "Miss Vance will be staying with us indefinitely," Gideon said, his tone brooking no argument. "She is to be installed in the blue room in the east wing." "The blue room?" "Mrs." Gable repeated, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "That room has not been aired in months, Your Grace, And where is the young lady's maid? I shall have someone show her to the servants' quarters. She has no maid, Gideon said, his voice dropping a degree in temperature. And she is not a servant to be quartered in the attic, Mrs. Gable. She is here to assist me with the estate administration. She will dine with me, and she will be treated with the respect due a gentlewoman. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a line so tight they almost disappeared. She looked at Helena again, and this time the hostility was open. In Mrs. Gable's world, gentlemen did not bring young, beautiful, impoverished women to their country estates in the dead of night to help with administration. There was only one word for what Helena was, and it was not secretary. It was a word that polite society whispered behind fans, a word that stained. Helena met the housekeeper's gaze, understanding perfectly what the woman was thinking. She wanted to shrink, to explain, to scream that she was a victim of a poker game, not a seductress, but she knew it would make no difference. To explain was to lose dignity. I can prepare the room myself if the staff is indisposed, Helena said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast hall. That will not be necessary, Gideon cut in. Mrs. Gable, see to it immediately, and have a tray sent up to Miss Vance. She is tired. As you wish, Your Grace, Mrs. Gable said, her tone dripping with icy compliance. She turned to Helena, her eyes cold. Follow me, miss. Gideon did not say good night. He turned and walked toward the library, his boots striking the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a retreat. He was fleeing the awkwardness he had created, leaving Helena to face the judgment of his household alone. Helena picked up her valise, her knuckles white, and followed Mrs. Gable up the sweeping staircase. The portraits of long-dead Althorpe ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to mirror the housekeeper's disdain. They walked down long, draughty corridors, where the candles guttered in the draughts, finally stopping at a heavy oak door at the end of the east wing. Mrs. Gable opened the door and stepped aside, not bothering to light the fire. The room is as His Grace requested, she said. Dinner will be brought up. Though I must say, miss, the master usually prefers his arrangements to remain in London. Holloway Hall is a respectable house. We have never had this sort of irregularity before. The insult was precise and cutting. Helena stepped into the room, placing her bag on a chair to steady her trembling hands. She turned to face the older woman, summoning the last reserves of her strength. I am here to work, Mrs. Gable, Helena said, her voice trembling but clear. I am not here to be an irregularity. I am here because I have no other choice. Mrs. Gable sniffed, clearly unconvinced. Everyone has a choice, miss. Some just choose the path of least resistance. With that, she turned and closed the door, leaving Helena in the semi-darkness. Helena stood in the center of the room, listening to the housekeeper's footsteps fade away. The blue room was large and oppressive. The furniture was covered in dust sheets that looked like ghosts in the moonlight filtering through the heavy curtains. The air was cold and smelled of damp velvet and disuse. Helena walked to the window and looked out at the black void of the parklands. She was miles from anywhere, trapped in a house that despised her, owned by a man who could barely look at her. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was not a guest. She was not a secretary. She was a possession, a living receipt for a gambling debt. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the dust sheet crinkling beneath her, and for the first time in 3 days, she allowed a single tear to escape. But only one. She wiped it away furiously. She would not give them the satisfaction of her despair. If they thought she was a fallen woman, she would prove them wrong. If they thought she was weak, she would show them iron. The next morning broke grey and sullen, the rain having settled into a persistent drizzle. Helena had slept poorly, the silence of the country unnerving after the constant hum of London. She dressed in her brown merino wool dress, the only practical garment she had, and smoothed her hair with trembling fingers. She washed her face with the cold water from the pitcher, the shock of it helping to clear her mind. A maid, a young girl who looked terrified to be near her, had brought a tray of toast and tea and fled before Helena could even say thank you. Helena ate quickly, needing the strength, then waited. At 9 o'clock, Bennet knocked on the door. His Grace requests your presence in the study, miss. Helena followed him downstairs. The house looked different in the daylight, less menacing, perhaps, but more melancholy. The wear and tear were visible now, the faded patches on the rugs, the water stains on the ceiling corners. It was a house of immense wealth that had stopped caring about itself. Bennett led her to a set of double doors on the ground floor and opened them. The study was a masculine sanctuary of dark wood, leather, and the smell of tobacco and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that looked as if they hadn't been touched in a decade. In the center of the room, behind a massive mahogany desk that looked like a barricade, sat Gideon. He did not stand when she entered. He was buried behind towers of ledgers, loose papers, and scrolls. His coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked exhausted, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been wrestling with the documents for hours. "Close the door," he said, without looking up. Helena obeyed, the click of the latch sounding loud in the room. She walked toward the desk and stopped, standing like a soldier reporting for duty. She waited. Gideon finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the navy blue dulled by fatigue. He gestured to the chaos on his desk. "This," he said, his voice raspy, "is the state of the Rothmore estate." Helena looked at the piles. It was a disaster. Invoices were mixed with personal correspondence. Tax records were buried under architectural drawings. Tenant complaints were used as coasters for inkwells. "My steward in London handles my investments and the parliamentary affairs," Gideon said, rubbing his temples. "But the local management, the management of the land, the tenants, the harvest, the wool, it has been left to the local overseer, a man named Barrow. And," Helena prompted when he fell silent. "And the numbers do not add up," Gideon said, frustration leaking into his voice. "I have money, Miss Vance. I have more money than I can spend. But this estate bleeds. Every month the expenses rise and the income falls. I am told it is the weather, the market, the bad luck of the tenants. But I look at these ledgers and I see nothing but noise. I cannot find the truth in this mess." He pushed a heavy, leather-bound ledger toward her. It slid across the polished wood and stopped at her fingertips. "You said you managed your father's lands," Gideon said. "You said you knew administration." "I did," Helena said. "I kept the books for the Viscountcy of Vance for 5 years. We had little money, so every penny had to be accounted for." "Good," Gideon said. He stood up abruptly, towering over the desk. He looked at her with a challenge in his eyes. "Then prove to me that £30,000 was not a complete waste of resources. Organise this. Find out why my estate is failing. Tell me where the money is going." Helena looked at the ledger, then back at him. "You want me to audit your entire estate? I want you to make sense of it," Gideon said. He picked up his coat and shrugged it on. "I have to ride out to the north perimeter to inspect a collapsed wall. I will be gone until dinner. By the time I return, I expect you to have made a start." He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. He smelled of soap and sandalwood, a clean, sharp scent that was disarming. "Do not disappoint me, Helena," he said softly, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange on his tongue, intimate and distant all at once. "Mrs. Gable and the staff will endure your presence because I command it. But respect, that you must earn. And in this house, respect is earned by competence, not by birth." He strode past her and left the room, leaving her alone in the silence of the study. Helena stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at the door he had exited, feeling a complex mix of anger and determination. He had thrown her into the deep end, expecting her to drown. He thought she was a sheltered aristocrat who would be defeated by columns of figures and the smell of old paper. Slowly, Helena reached out and opened the ledger. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, ink blots, and nonsensical entries. It was not just negligence, it was chaos. But as she scanned the lines, her eyes narrowed. She saw a pattern. A purchase of grain recorded twice. A sale of wool listed at half the market price she knew to be current. These were not mistakes. These were lies. She looked around the room, at the mountains of paper that represented the Duke's power and his blindness. He was a man who looked at the horizon, at railways and laws, and missed the rot beneath his feet. He needed her. He didn't know it yet, and he certainly didn't want to admit it, but he needed her. Helena Vance pulled up a heavy oak chair. She sat down, smoothed her skirts, and reached for a fresh quill. She dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid gleaming like obsidian. She was not a mistress. She was not a victim. She was the daughter of a line of viscounts, and she knew how to run land better than any man who spent his time in London clubs. Let Mrs. Gable sneer. Let the Duke brood. She would tear this estate apart page by page until she found the truth. And when she did, Gideon Althorpe would have to look her in the eye and acknowledge that she was worth far more than the debt he held over her head. She began to write, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the vast, silent house, a sound of order being imposed on chaos, the first strike in the battle for her own salvation. The library of Holloway Hall had become Helena Vance's world, a sanctuary of dust and paper where she waged a silent war against chaos. For 2 weeks, she had barely seen the sun, her existence reduced to the scratching of a quill against parchment and the turning of heavy, mildewed pages. The estate was not merely disorganized, it was a labyrinth of negligence. Gideon Althorpe, the Duke of Rothmore, possessed a fortune that could rival the crown's, yet his ancestral home was bleeding money from 1,000 tiny cuts. Helena had traced the hemorrhaging through stacks of receipts that dated back 5 years, finding payments for repairs that were never made, wages for phantom labourers, and feed for livestock that did not exist. It was a tedious, exhausting puzzle, but as she worked, a strange sense of purpose began to replace the despair that had consumed her in London. She was no longer just a pawn in a wager. She was the only person in this vast, cold house who saw the truth. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, while rain lashed against the tall, mullioned windows, that the pattern finally emerged with undeniable clarity. Helena was cross-referencing the shearing records from the previous spring with the sales ledgers from the local market in Bakewell. She paused, her finger tracing a line of ink that seemed innocuous enough at first glance. The entry claimed that the estate had sold 200 sacks of raw wool to a merchant in Leeds for a sum that was pitifully low, even for the depressed market of 1823. Helena frowned, pulling a second ledger from the stack. The inventory of the sheep count. According to the steward's own records, the flock was healthy, the yield high. The weight recorded at the shearing sheds did not match the weight sold at the market. Somewhere between the shearing blades and the merchant's cart, 3 tons of prime wool had simply vanished into thin air. She sat back in the heavy oak chair, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. This was not incompetence. Incompetence was messy. This was precise. The numbers had been doctored to balance the final columns, hiding the theft in the fluctuating price of the commodity. Someone was skimming the cream of the estate's produce and selling it privately, pocketing the difference while the Duke was told that the market was cruel. Helena looked up at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was just past 2. Gideon was out riding the perimeter of the tenant farms, as he had been doing every day since their arrival, trying to understand the physical decay of his land while she diagnosed the financial rot. He would not be back for hours. If she waited to show him the numbers, he might dismiss them as a clerical error. He still looked at her with that guarded, distant expression, as if waiting for her to fail or to ask for a new dress. She needed more than suspicion. She needed a confession, or at least visual proof. She stood up, smoothing the skirts of her brown merino dress. It was the same dress she had worn leaving London, now cleaned but showing the strain of daily wear. She did not care. She grabbed her shawl, throwing it over her shoulders, and picked up the ledger. She marched out of the library, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the hall. Mrs. Gable was dusting a vase near the staircase and stopped to watch her pass. The housekeeper's face was a mask of severe disapproval, as it had been since the night of Helena's arrival, but Helena did not pause to offer explanations. She pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the damp, blustery afternoon. The stables and the main agricultural barns lay to the west of the house, a cluster of stone buildings that smelled of wet hay, manure, and leather. The rain had softened to a mist, clinging to the hills like a shroud. Helena navigated the muddy puddles with determination, her eyes fixed on the shearing barn. She knew that Thomas Barrow, the estate's local overseer, would be there. Barrow was a man of 40, with a face reddened by gin and wind, and a manner that vacillated between obsequious fawning when the Duke was present and sneering arrogance when dealing with the tenants. Helena had met him only once, when Gideon had introduced her as his assistant, a title Barrow had greeted with a smirk that suggested he knew exactly what kind of assistance a woman provided a duke. She found him inside the main barn, leaning against a wooden post, shouting instructions to a young stable boy who was struggling to lift a heavy saddle. Barrow held a riding crop in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. When he saw Helena enter, the tapping stopped. He straightened slowly, his eyes raking over her figure with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he drawled, his voice thick with a Derbyshire accent he exaggerated to sound rustic. "If it isn't the Duke's fancy London lady. Lost your way to the rose garden, miss? I am exactly where I intend to be, Mr. Barrow," Helena said, her voice crisp and steady. She stopped 5 paces from him, refusing to be intimidated by his size or the stench of stale alcohol that wafted from him. "I have a question regarding the shearing logs from last April." Barrow laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at the stable boy, who was watching with wide eyes. "You hear that, lad? The lady wants to talk about sheep." He turned back to Helena, his smile vanishing. "Listen here, miss. The Duke might let you play with his books in the big house to keep you busy, but out here, this is men's work. You wouldn't know a ewe from a ram if it stepped on your foot. Go back inside and warm yourself by the fire. I know that a Lincoln long wool produces approximately 12 pounds of fleece per shear," Helena said, her tone icy. "And I know that this estate maintains a flock of 600 head. That should yield over 7,000 pounds of wool. Yet your ledger records the sale of only 4,000 pounds. The silence that fell over the barn was absolute. The stable boy froze. Barrow's face darkened, the red flushing to a deep, angry purple. He took a step toward her, the riding crop twitching in his hand. "Paperwork is tricky," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Things get lost. Moths eat the wool. Damp rots the bales. You don't understand the realities of farming." "I understand mathematics, Mr. Barrow," Helena countered, holding her ground though every instinct screamed at her to run. "And I understand that 3,000 pounds of wool does not simply rot without a record of disposal. I also noticed that a private merchant in Matlock, a cousin of yours by marriage, I believe, began selling high-grade wool just weeks after our shearing season." Barrow moved faster than a man of his bulk should have been able to. He closed the distance between them, looming over her, using his height to block the light from the barn door. "You are meddling in things that don't concern you, girl," he hissed, spitting the words. "The Duke doesn't care about a few sacks of wool. He's a London man. He cares about his politics and his parties. He doesn't look at the dirt. And he certainly won't listen to the likes of you over a man who's run this land for 10 years. "He will listen when I show him the theft," Helena said, lifting her chin. Barrow grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising, his fingers digging into the wool of her sleeve. "You won't show him anything. You're nothing here. A paid-for piece of skirt. Do you think the staff doesn't know? Do you think we don't know he bought you? You're a whore with a ledger. And if you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut and do your job in the bedroom, not the barn." Helena gasped at the pain and the insult, struggling to pull her arm free. "Unhand me. Make me," Barrow sneered, twisting her arm. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the barn entrance, blocking out the grey light of the afternoon. The sound of hooves striking stone thunderously filled the air, followed by the snort of a beast reined in hard. Barrow looked up, distracted, and in that split second, Helena wrenched her arm free and stumbled back. Standing in the doorway, framed by the mist and mounted on a massive black stallion that looked like a creature of war, was Gideon. He was drenched, his heavy riding coat soaked through, water dripping from the brim of his hat. But it was his face that terrified. He was not the detached, cold aristocrat of the library. He was fury incarnate. He had heard. The acoustics of the stone barn had carried Barrow's voice clearly to the yard. "Get down," Gideon said, The command was spoken softly, but it carried such violence that the horses in the stalls stamped their feet nervously. Barrow paled, stumbling back. "Your Grace, The girl was confused. "I was just explaining." Gideon swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. He dropped the reins, not bothering to tether the horse, and walked into the barn. He moved with a predatory grace, his boots crunching on the straw. He did not look at Helena. His eyes were fixed entirely on the overseer. "You called her a whore," Gideon said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "And you laid hands on her." "She was accusing me of theft," Barrow stammered, backing away until he hit a wooden partition. "She doesn't know what she's saying. She's hysterical." "She is right," Gideon said. He stopped a foot from Barrow. "I have been looking at the fences, Barrow. I have been looking at the flocks. I suspected the numbers were wrong, but I did not know how deep the rot went until I heard Miss Vance recite the weights." He turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging Helena. She was clutching her bruised arm, breathing hard, but her eyes were dry and fierce. "Is the calculation correct, Miss Vance?" Gideon asked. "Yes, Your Grace," Helena answered, her voice trembling only slightly. £3,000 of wool missing. The market value is nearly £400. Gideon turned back to Barrow. "You stole from me. That is a crime. But you insulted a lady under my protection, and you dared to touch her. That is a death sentence. Your Grace, please." Barrow fell to his knees in the straw, weeping instantly. "I have a family. It was a mistake. Get off my land," Gideon ordered. "You will leave now. You will take nothing but the clothes on your back. If I see you on Rothmore soil after sunset, I will have you transported for embezzlement. And if you ever speak Miss Vance's name again, I will find you. Go!" Gideon roared the last word, and Barrow scrambled to his feet, running past them, slipping in the mud in his haste to escape the Duke's wrath. The stable boy, terrified, melted into the shadows of the tackroom. Silence returned to the barn, heavy and thick. Gideon stood there for a moment, his chest heaving slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbing. He turned to Helena. He took off his gloves, his movements deliberate. "Let me see your arm," he said. "It is nothing," Helena said, taking a step back. She was shaken, not by Barrow, but by the violence she had seen in Gideon's eyes. Violence in her defense. Gideon did not ask again. He stepped forward and gently took her arm. His touch was surprisingly light, a stark contrast to Barrow's grip. He pushed back the sleeve of her dress. 4 red finger marks were already darkening on her pale skin. Gideon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I should have called the magistrate," he muttered. "I should have let him hang. He is gone," Helena said quietly. "That is enough." He looked up from her arm to her face. The rain had misted her hair, turning the blonde strands into gold filaments. Her brown eyes were wide, searching his. "You were right," he said, and there was a note of wonder in his voice. "You found it. I have had 3 stewards from London try to audit this estate, and none of them caught the wool discrepancy. How did you know?" "My father raised sheep," Helena said. "I know the yield. A spreadsheet is only paper, Your Grace. You have to know the land to catch the lie." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a debt, not as a burden, but as a force. He dropped her arm gently. "Come," he said. "You are cold, and I believe we have a dinner to attend." The walk back to the house was different. Gideon did not stride ahead. He walked beside her, matching his long steps to her shorter ones. He shielded her from the wind with his own body. A subtle, unconscious gesture of protection. When they entered the main hall, Mrs. Gable was waiting. The news of the scene in the barn had clearly travelled through the servants' grapevine with the speed of a telegraph. The housekeeper looked at Helena, at her muddy hem, her wind-blown hair, and the way the Duke stood protectively at her shoulder. Mrs. Gable's eyes dropped to the bruise that was faintly visible on Helena's wrist. Her expression softened, the rigid lines of judgment cracking. She saw a woman who had fought for the house, not one who was leeching off it. I have prepared a hot bath for Miss Vance, Mrs. Gable said, addressing Gideon but looking at Helena. And I have taken the liberty of brewing the Ceylon tea, miss. It is the best for shock. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Helena whispered, surprised by the sudden kindness. And, Mrs. Gable added, pausing as she turned to leave, dinner will be served in the main dining room tonight. I have instructed the cook to prepare the venison. It is a celebratory meal, I believe, now that the thief is gone. Gideon nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. When the housekeeper had gone, Gideon turned to Helena. Go and rest. I will see you at 7. The dinner that night was a revelation. For the first time, they did not eat in the library or on trays in their separate rooms. They sat at the long mahogany table, bathed in the warm glow of candlelight. The silver gleamed, the crystal sparkled, and the distance between them, though physically long across the table, felt shorter than it ever had. Gideon had changed into formal evening wear, a stark black coat and a crisp white cravat that emphasized the tan of his skin and the startling blue of his eyes. Helena wore her only other dress, a simple cream silk that was years out of fashion, but draped elegantly over her frame. They ate in silence for the first course, but it was a companionable silence. When the servants cleared the soup, Gideon poured wine into her glass himself, waving away the footman. Tell me, he said, leaning back in his chair. When you are not catching thieves or analyzing wool yields, what do you do, Helena? Helena looked at him over the rim of her glass. She was not used to being asked questions about herself. I read, mostly. History. Philosophy. My father's library was the only thing he didn't gamble away, perhaps because he never opened the books. And what is your philosophy? Gideon asked, watching her intently. Regarding fate. Helena thought for a moment. I believe fate is a convenient excuse for men who are too cowardly to take responsibility for their actions. My brother blames fate for his losses. You blamed fate for finding me in that club, but it wasn't fate. It was a choice. Every card laid down is a choice. Gideon paused, the wine glass halfway to his lips. He looked struck by her words. And my choice to bring you here? Was that cowardice? Helena met his gaze boldly. No, that was arrogance. You thought you could solve a human problem with a checkbook. You thought you could buy a clear conscience. Gideon laughed. It was a low, rusty sound, as if he hadn't used it in years. It transformed his face, softening the harsh angles, making him look younger and devastatingly handsome. You are merciless, Miss Vance, he said, shaking his head. Most women would have flattered me. They would have called it generosity. I am not most women, Helena said, and I am not free to flatter you. I am your employee. I owe you the truth. The laughter faded from Gideon's eyes, replaced by a heat that made Helena's breath catch in her throat. He looked at her not as an employee, and certainly not as a debt. He looked at her as a man looks at a woman who challenges him. No, he said softly, his voice rough. You are certainly not like most women. You have a mind like a razor and a spine like steel. I have spent 10 years in London society, surrounded by women who are trained to be decorative and agreeable. I had forgotten that a woman could be formidable. The compliment hung in the air, charged and dangerous. Helena felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her plate, her heart racing. I am simply trying to pay my debt, Your Grace. Gideon leaned forward, his blue eyes capturing hers. Gideon, he corrected. When we are alone, Helena, please. My name is Gideon. Helena looked up. To use his Christian name was a breach of every social protocol, an intimacy that suggested a relationship far beyond that of a master and servant. But the way he said it, as a plea, not an order, disarmed her. Gideon, she tested the word. It felt heavy and significant on her tongue. He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. Thank you. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of conversation. They talked of the estate, of the laws regarding enclosure, of the poetry of Byron, which Gideon despised and Helena secretly admired. For the first time in her life, Helena felt intellectually met. She was not hiding her intelligence to soothe a fragile male ego. She was sharpening it against his. As the candles burned low, casting long shadows against the panelled walls, a comfortable silence settled between them. Gideon watched her, his expression thoughtful. He noticed the way the candlelight caught the gold in her hair, the intelligence in her dark brown eyes, the strength in her delicate hands. He realized, with a jolt of panic and exhilaration, that he was no longer thinking about the £30,000. He was thinking about how empty the chair opposite him would look if she were ever to leave. "You have done a great service to this house today," Gideon said quietly. "You saved me from a fool." "You saved me first," Helena reminded him. "From a monster." Gideon stood up. He walked to the end of the table and offered her his hand. She took it, feeling the calluses on his palm from the rains, the warmth of his skin. He pulled her up, not letting go immediately. They stood close, the heat radiating between them. "I did not save you to put you to work in a barn," Gideon said, his voice low. "I am sorry for what happened today. For Barrow. For everything. It is part of the bargain," Helena whispered, unable to look away from his mouth. Gideon's thumb brushed over her knuckles, a caress that sent a shockwave through her arm. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps the bargain is changing." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the skin just above the bruise Barrow had left. It was a gesture of apology, of reverence, and of something else entirely. Helena trembled. She knew she should pull away. She knew that falling for the man who owned her debt was the most dangerous gamble of all. But as she looked into his navy eyes, she saw the loneliness there, mirroring her own. "Good night, Helena," he whispered against her skin. "Good night, Gideon," she breathed. She turned and fled the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ran up the stairs to the blue room, closing the door and leaning against it, gasping for air. She had faced a thief in a barn without flinching, but the touch of the Duke's lips on her hand had undone her completely. She was no longer just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting against her own heart, and she was terrified she was going to lose. The letter that precipitated the crisis arrived on a Wednesday morning, carried on a silver tray by Bennett, whose expression was even more lugubrious than usual. Gideon was in the study, reviewing the preliminary sketches for a new drainage system Helena had proposed for the south pasture, while Helena herself was seated at a smaller desk by the window, transcribing a stack of tenant petitions. The easy silence between them, forged in the wake of the barn incident and solidified over shared dinners, was broken by the crack of the wax seal. Gideon scanned the parchment, his dark brows knitting together in a scowl that usually signalled a disaster involving Parliament or the French. He crumpled the letter in his fist and tossed it onto the mahogany surface of his desk. "Damn," he muttered, a rare curse in her presence. "My Aunt Agatha has the gout." Helena paused, her quill hovering over the paper. "I am sorry to hear that, Your Grace. Is it serious?" "For her, it is painful. For me, it is a catastrophe," Gideon said, standing up and pacing to the fireplace. She was to arrive tomorrow to act as hostess for the dinner party on Saturday. The parliamentary envoys, Lord Liverpool's Under-Secretary, and the local magistrates are all coming. It is not merely a social gathering, it is a political manoeuvre to secure funding for the railway spur. Helena understood the stakes immediately. In the intricate dance of British politics, deals were rarely struck on the floor of the House of Lords. They were forged over roast venison and claret, in rooms where the seating arrangement was as strategic as a battlefield map. A bachelor duke could host a hunting party alone, but a formal dinner required a hostess, a woman to manage the conversation, soothe bruised egos, and signal the domestic stability of the house. "Is there no other female relation you can call upon?" Helena asked. "None who can get here in 3 days," Gideon replied, turning to look at her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the calculation in his navy blue eyes. "Except one." Helena felt a cold prickle of apprehension. She set down her pen. "Your Grace, surely you do not mean—" "You know the estate better than anyone," Gideon said, walking toward her. You know the political landscape because you have been organizing my correspondence. You have the breeding of a viscount's daughter and the intelligence of a prime minister. I am also the sister of a man who sold me in a gambling hell, Helena said, her voice rising slightly. And I am living in your house without a chaperone, working as a secretary. The rumors in the village are already vicious. If I sit at the head of your table, you will not be projecting stability. You will be confirming the scandal. Let them talk, Gideon said dismissively, though his eyes remained intense. These men need my influence more than they care about my morality. And their wives, well, their wives will be vicious regardless. I need a hostess, Helena. I need someone who can steer the conversation away from the scandal and toward the railway investment. I need you. You are asking me to walk into a lion's den wearing a target, Helena countered, standing up to meet his gaze. The local gentry despise me. To them, I am a fallen woman. Then show them they are wrong, Gideon said softly. He reached out, almost touching her arm, but stopped himself. Show them what I see. Show them the woman who stared down Thomas Barrow and audited a failing estate in a week. If you do this, Helena, you are not just a debt to be paid. You are the mistress of this house in all but name. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. In all but name. It was a temptation and a trap. If she failed, she would humiliate him and destroy the little respect she had clawed back. But if she refused, she was merely the employee, the victim, the poor relation hiding in the shadows. I have nothing to wear, she said, the practical objection masking her terrifying consent. My trunks were never sent from London. I have 2 dresses, Gideon. One is for working, and the other you have seen 3 times. Leave that to Mrs. Gable, Gideon said, a small smile touching his lips, signalling his victory. Just say yes. Helena looked at him, at the man who had saved her from Finch and given her a purpose, however complicated. Yes, she whispered. God help us both, yes. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation that saw the entire household mobilized. The kitchen staff, terrified of the Duke's high standards, began curing meats and clarifying stocks. The maids polished silver until it gleamed like moonlight. But the true miracle occurred in the sewing room on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Gable, once Helena's jailer and now her fiercest ally, had descended upon the attic like a general raiding an armory. She had unearthed a trunk belonging to Gideon's late mother, the Dowager Duchess. The styles were 30 years out of date, but the fabrics, heavy emerald velvets, ivory silks, and midnight blue satins, were timeless. We cannot use the velvet. It is too heavy for the season, Mrs. Gable muttered, her mouth full of pins as she draped a length of silver-grey silk over Helena's shoulder. But this has possibilities. For hours, Helena stood on a stool while Mrs. Gable and a young seamstress from the village cut, pinned, and stitched. The housekeeper worked with a fervour that suggested this was not just about a dress. It was about the honour of Holloway Hall. She knew the local gossips, Lady Beresford and Mrs. Sterling, and the thought of them looking down their noses at her, Miss Vance, was unacceptable. They will expect you to look gaudy, Mrs. Gable said, ripping a seam with a violent tear. They expect a woman of low virtue to wear red or too much lace. We will give them ice. We will give them a queen. By Saturday evening, the transformation was complete. The carriage wheels of the guests began to crunch on the gravel drive at 7 o'clock sharp. Gideon stood in the entrance hall, looking impeccable in formal evening dress, the star of the garter pinned to his coat. He was nervous, though he would never admit it. He adjusted his cuffs, glancing up the staircase for the 10th time. They are arriving, Your Grace, Bennet intoned, opening the double doors. The first to enter were Lord and Lady Beresford. Lord Beresford was a rotund man, interested only in hunting, but his wife was a hatchet-faced woman, known for her sharp tongue and her strict adherence to social codes. She swept in, her eyes immediately darting around the hall, looking for the scandal she had heard whispered about. Duke, Lady Beresford said, curtsying. So kind of you to host us. And where is dear Agatha? I heard she was to be here. My aunt is indisposed, Gideon said smoothly. However, the household is in excellent hands. Before Lady Beresford could press for details, the rest of the guests poured in. Mr. Sterling, the magistrate, with his timid wife, Sir Robert Peel's under-secretary, a man of sharp intellect named Mr. Colborne, and several other local landowners. The air was thick with expectation. They had all heard the rumours of the London woman living at the Hall. They were ready to be shocked, ready to be superior. Then the clock chimed the quarter hour, and Helena appeared at the top of the stairs. The conversation in the hall died instantly. Gideon looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. Mrs. Gable had outdone herself. The dress was a masterpiece of simplicity, fashioned from the silver-grey silk. It was cut in the high-waisted Empire style, but with a severity that was striking. It had no lace, no ribbons, no frivolity. The sleeves were long and fitted, the neckline modest but revealing the graceful arch of her neck. Her honey-blonde hair was swept up in an intricate knot, secured not with jewels, but with a simple ribbon of the same silver silk. She wore no jewellery, no necklace, no earrings. She needed none. She looked like a statue of Artemis come to life, cold, beautiful, and utterly untouchable. She descended the stairs with a calm she did not feel, her hand resting lightly on the banister. Every eye was on her. She saw the shock in the men's faces and the narrowing of the women's eyes. She saw the judgment, but she also saw the grudging acknowledgement that she did not look like a mistress. She looked like a duchess. Gideon stepped forward to the bottom of the stairs, extending his hand. He did not introduce her as his secretary. He did not apologize for her presence. "May I present Miss Helena Vance?" Gideon said, his voice ringing clearly in the silent hall. "My hostess for the evening." Helena took his hand, her fingers cold in his warm grip. She curtsied to the room, a movement of perfect, practiced grace that she had learned at her father's knee before the gambling took him. "Welcome to Holloway Hall," she said, her voice steady. "His Grace has told me so much about you all." The dinner began with a tension that was palpable, brittle as spun sugar. Helena sat at the foot of the long table, opposite Gideon, with the Under-Secretary Mr. Colborne to her right and Lord Beresford to her left. The soup, a clear consommé, was served in silence, broken only by the clinking of spoons. It was Lady Beresford, seated near Gideon, who fired the first shot. She had been simmering with indignation since the introduction, unable to reconcile the elegant woman at the table with the salacious gossip she had spread at tea-time. "Tell me, Miss Vance," Lady Beresford said loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "I understand you are from London. Do you have family in Derbyshire, or are you travelling alone?" Helena placed her spoon down gently. "My family is in London, Lady Beresford. I am here assisting the Duke with the reorganisation of the estate archives." "Archives," Lady Beresford repeated, exchanging a knowing look with Mrs. Sterling. "How fascinating. I wasn't aware that secretarial work required one to preside over formal dinners. Usually such duties fall to the lady of the house, or a wife. When the lady of the house is absent, the duty falls to the one most capable of ensuring the comfort of the guests," Helena replied smoothly. His Grace felt that given the political importance of this evening, a hostess was required to ensure the conversation flowed as freely as the wine. "Speaking of family," Mrs. Sterling piped up, her voice high and nervous, clearly egged on by her friend. "I heard a disturbing rumour about a Viscount Vance in London. A brother of yours, perhaps. They say he has fallen into quite severe financial embarrassment. Gambling, was it?" The table went deadly silent. It was a direct, brutal attack, meant to shame Helena by associating her with her brother's ruin. Gideon's hand tightened on his wineglass, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to intervene, to crush Mrs. Sterling with a rebuke, but Helena caught his eye. She gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. "Let me." Helena turned to Mrs. Sterling, her expression one of polite concern rather than shame. "It is true, Mrs. Sterling. My brother has indeed suffered the consequences of the vice that plagues so many of our class. It is a tragedy, but one that has taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of economy." "Economy?" Mr. Colborne asked, looking at her with sudden interest. Indeed, Helena said, turning her attention to the Undersecretary, effectively cutting the women out of the conversation. We often speak of the national debt and the management of the Treasury, Mr. Colborne, yet we allow the private estates that form the backbone of this country to be managed with reckless abandon. My brother's failure was a failure of oversight. It is precisely why I am here. The Duke understands that a modern estate cannot rely on feudal traditions and blind trust. It requires audit, it requires strategy, and it requires the courage to face unpleasant numbers. She paused, looking around the table, meeting the eyes of the men who controlled the county. The railway you are discussing tonight, she continued, is not just a convenience. It is a necessity for efficient transport of goods. But a railway is useless if the estates it serves are bankrupt, because their owners are too proud to count their own sheep. His Grace is building a future where land is an asset, not just a playground. I am merely the instrument of that modernization. Mr. Colborne stared at her. He was a man of business, a technocrat who despised the frivolous nature of the aristocracy. In Helena, he saw a kindred spirit. A remarkable perspective, Miss Vance, Colborne said, raising his glass. Most people see the railway as a blight on the landscape. You see it as the arteries of commerce. I confess, I did not expect to discuss economic theory tonight, but I am delightfully surprised. But surely, Lady Beresford interrupted, desperate to regain control, a woman's place is not in the counting house. It is hardly feminine. There is nothing feminine about poverty, Lady Beresford, Helena said, her voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. And there is nothing masculine about waste. If we wish to preserve our way of life, we must be willing to work for it. The Duke recognizes this. It is why he is the most powerful man in Derbyshire, because he values competence over convention. Gideon watched her, mesmerized. She had taken the very thing they tried to use to shame her, her work, her brother's ruin, and turned it into a shield of competence. She had aligned herself with progress, with the future, making her attackers look like relics of a bygone frivolous era. She was magnificent. The rest of the dinner was a triumph. Mr. Colborne spent the entire meal engaging Helena in a debate about the Corn Laws, completely ignoring the other ladies. The local magistrates, seeing the Undersecretary's approval, quickly fell in line, treating Helena with a newfound respect. Lady Beresford sat in sullen silence, defeated by a woman who refused to be a victim. When the final course was cleared and the guests moved to the drawing room for coffee, Gideon found a moment to approach Helena. She was standing by the fireplace, her hand resting on the mantel, trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "You were extraordinary," Gideon murmured, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You didn't just host them, Helena. You conquered them." "I merely told the truth," Helena said, not looking at him. "They wanted to see a kept woman. I showed them a business partner." "You showed them a Duchess," Gideon corrected, his voice intense. Helena looked up at him then, startled by the rawness in his tone. "Do not say that." "Why not?" "It is what everyone in that room is thinking now. Colborne told me you are the most intelligent woman he has met in 10 years. Colborne is a politician. He likes that I support his railway," Helena said, deflecting. "And what do I like?" Gideon asked, stepping closer, invading her personal space in a way that was improper for the drawing room, yet neither of them moved away. Before she could answer, Lady Beresford announced loudly that her carriage was waiting, signalling the end of the evening. The departure was a blur of bows and polite lies, but as the last carriage rolled away into the night, the silence that fell over Holloway Hall was heavy with unspoken words. Gideon locked the front door and turned to find Helena standing at the foot of the stairs, looking exhausted. The silver dress shimmered in the candlelight, making her look ethereal. "Come to the library," Gideon said. "We should debrief." It was a pretext, and they both knew it. Helena followed him into the darkened room. Gideon lit a single lamp, casting long shadows across the rows of books. He poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to her. "To the audit," he said, raising his glass. "To the railway," she replied, taking a sip. The liquid burned her throat, a a welcome fire against the chill that was settling in her bones. Gideon set his glass down and looked at her. The distance between them had vanished. The energy that had sustained them through the dinner was shifting into something more volatile. "When you walked down those stairs," Gideon said, his voice rough, "I forgot every argument I had prepared for Colborne. I forgot my aunt's gout. I forgot my own name." "It was the dress," Helena said, her breath catching. "Mrs. Gable is a genius." "It was not the dress," Gideon said. He took a step toward her. "It was you. It has always been you, Helena. Since the moment I saw you holding that candle in your empty house, looking at me as if I were the devil, and yet refusing to back down." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers trailing down to her jawline. His skin was warm, his touch electric. Helena's eyes fluttered shut. She leaned into his hand, her body betraying her resolve. "Gideon," she whispered. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, leaning closer. His other hand came to rest on her waist, pulling her against him. She could feel the hard line of his body, the rapid beat of his heart against hers. "Tell me to stop, and I will. But do not tell me this is just business. Not after tonight." He lowered his head. His lips were inches from hers. She could smell the brandy and the sandalwood. She wanted him. God, how she wanted him. She wanted to forget the debt, forget the shame, forget the world outside this room and simply be the woman he looked at with such hunger. But the truth was a cold knife in her gut. She placed her hands on his chest and pushed. Not hard, but enough to break the spell. "Stop," she whispered. Gideon froze. He pulled back slightly, confusion clouding his eyes. "Helena, I cannot do this," she said, her voice trembling. She stepped out of his embrace, hugging her arms around herself as if she were suddenly freezing. "I cannot let you kiss me." "Why?" Gideon asked, the hurt in his voice raw. "Do you feel nothing?" "I feel too much," she cried, spinning around to face him. "That is the problem. Don't you see? Tonight was a play, a performance. I wore your mother's dress. I sat at your table. I defended your politics. For a few hours, I played the part of the Duchess. But I am not a Duchess, Gideon. I am a debt." "You are not a debt to me," Gideon said fiercely. "I told you." "It doesn't matter what you say in the dark," Helena interrupted, tears finally spilling over. "The paper still exists. The wager still exists. You bought me. If I sleep with you, if I let you love me, I am proving every vile thing Lady Beresford thinks. I become the woman who traded her body for £30,000. I would burn that paper," Gideon vowed. "I would tear it to shreds right now. But you haven't," Helena said softly. "And until the debt is gone, until I am free to walk out that door of my own will, I cannot stay in your arms. Because love requires a choice, Gideon. And I have none." Gideon stared at her, the truth of her words striking him like a physical blow. He had been so caught up in his admiration, in his desire, that he had forgotten the fundamental power imbalance that lay between them. He owned her debt. As long as that hung over them, any intimacy was tainted by coercion, no matter how willing she seemed. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He looked at the woman he wanted more than anything in the world, and he realized that to have her, he had to let her go. But he couldn't let her go yet. Not with Finch still circling, not with the investigation unfinished. "You are right," Gideon said, his voice hollow. "Forgive me. I forgot myself." "No," Helena said, wiping her tears. "You forgot us. You forgot that we are on opposite sides of a ledger." She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. She looked back at him, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. "Thank you for the dress, Your Grace. It was a beautiful dream." Then she was gone, the click of the door echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Gideon turned back to the fire, picking up his glass and hurling it into the hearth. The crystal shattered, shards flying like diamonds, but the sound brought him no relief. He had won the political battle, but he was losing the war for her heart, defeated by the very thing he had used to save her, his money. The weeks that followed the dinner party were a strange, suspended season at Holloway Hall, a time of fragile peace that felt like the holding of a breath before a plunge. The spring rains had given way to the first tentative warmth of summer, turning the heather on the moors into a carpet of purple and the estate gardens into a riot of bloom. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted from one of icy coexistence to a quiet, intense partnership. Helena and Gideon worked side by side in the library, their desks pushed closer together, the silence between them no longer a wall but a bridge. They spoke of crop rotations, of tenant rights, and of the railway bill which was slowly winding its way through Parliament. But beneath the mundane discussions of business flowed a current of unspoken longing that was as terrified as it was undeniable. Gideon had kept his word. He had not touched her again since that night in the library. He treated her with a rigorous, almost painful courtesy, but Helena caught him watching her when he thought she was absorbed in her ledgers. His navy blue eyes would trace the line of her profile with a hunger that made her hands tremble, and her ink blot. She wanted him to break his promise. God help her. She woke in the middle of the night, reaching for a warmth that was not there, dreaming of the rough texture of his coat and the scent of sandalwood. But the shadow of the debt lay between them like a sword. £30,000. It was a sum that could build a fleet of ships or ruin a kingdom. As long as it existed, she was not his equal. She was his acquisition. And Helena Vance, for all her poverty, possessed a pride that would not allow her to be anyone's possession, even if the owner held her heart. On a Tuesday afternoon, the air in the library was heavy with the scent of beeswax and old paper. Gideon was standing by the window, reading a dispatch from London, his silhouette framed by the golden light. "The railway bill passed the second reading," he said, turning to her with a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Colborne gives you full credit. He says your argument about arteries of commerce swayed the undecided votes." Helena looked up from her stack of correspondence, feeling a flush of pleasure. "Mr. Colborne is too kind. I merely pointed out that profit is a language even the deafest peer can hear." "You are too modest," Gideon said, walking over to her desk. He rested his hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "You have saved this estate, Helena. The wool profits are up 20% since Barrow left. The tenants are actually paying rent again because they know the roofs are being fixed. You have done in 2 months what I failed to do in 5 years. You were busy governing the country, Gideon," she said softly, using his name. It still felt like a secret indulgence every time she said it. "I was busy running away," he corrected her, his voice low. "I hated this house. It was cold and empty. I didn't want to see the decay. You forced me to look at it. You made it a home." The intimacy of the moment was so sharp it hurt. Gideon leaned down, his face inches from her hair. "Helena," he whispered, "I have written to my solicitors in London. I am having the deed of debt transferred to a trust. I am looking for a way to annul it without triggering the tax laws. I want you free." His answer should arrive by courier within the week, sealed, formal, and impossible for any man to argue away. Helena's heart leaped. "You would do that?" "I would give the entire estate away if it meant you would look at me without seeing a jailer," he said. Before she could answer, before she could tell him that the jailer had long since become the saviour, the heavy oak doors of the library were thrown open with a violence that made them both jump. Bennett stood in the doorway. The old butler, usually the picture of unflappable stoicism, looked pale, his hands shaking at his sides. "Your Grace," Bennett stammered, his voice thin with panic. "We have visitors." Gideon straightened, the softness vanishing from his face instantly, replaced by the mask of the Duke. "I am not expecting anyone, Bennett. Who enters my house without being announced?" "I tried to stop them, Your Grace," Bennett said, wringing his hands. "But they have a warrant, and Lord Vance is with them." Helena dropped her quill. It clattered onto the desk, splashing ink across the ledger she had spent hours perfecting. "Rupert," she whispered, the blood draining from her face. Gideon's expression turned to granite. "Show them in." He did not need to wait. Footsteps, heavy and authoritative, echoed on the marble floor of the hallway. 3 men swept past the trembling butler and entered the library. The first was Rupert Vance. Helena barely recognized her brother. Gone was the dishevelled, weeping boy she had last seen in the gambling hell. He was dressed in a brand new suit of bottle green velvet, his cravat tied in the latest fashion, his hair pomaded and curled. He looked healthy, prosperous, and utterly pleased with himself. But his eyes, when they landed on Helena, slid away quickly, unable to hold her gaze. Behind him waddled Baron Oswald Finch. The Toad. He looked exactly as he had that night in London, sweaty, opulent, and radiating a smug malevolence. He wore a coat of purple silk that strained at the buttons, and his fingers were adorned with rings that glittered obscenely in the afternoon light. The third man was a stranger. He was tall, thin, and dressed in the sombre black robes of the judiciary. He carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of pinched self-importance. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," Finch said, his voice oily and loud in the quiet room. "I trust we are not interrupting anything domestic?" Gideon moved. He stepped in front of Helena, placing his body between her and the men, a shield of black wool and fury. "Get out," Gideon said. The command was quiet, deadly. "You are trespassing, Finch. And you, Vance. If you have come to beg for more money, you will find my patience has expired." Rupert laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Beg? Oh no, Rothmore. I haven't come to beg. I've come to settle accounts. We are here on a matter of legal restitution." The man in black spoke up. His voice was dry and scratchy, like shuffling papers. "I am Magistrate Thaddeus Crouch. I represent the interests of Lord Vance in the matter of the debt owed to your person." "There is no debt," Gideon said coldly. "I purchased the debt. It is held by me. It is my property to manage as I see fit." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Your Grace," Finch purred, stepping forward. He walked to the centre of the room, looking around the library with a sneer of appraisal. "You see, the contract drawn up at the Crimson Rook, which you signed, I might remind you, was a standard deed of collateral, and under the laws of debt and property, specifically the right of redemption, a debtor has the legal right to reclaim his collateral at any time within a calendar year, provided the principal sum and the interest are paid in full." Helena felt a cold hand squeeze her heart. Collateral. That was her. "The collateral," Gideon said, his voice dripping with ice, "is a human being, not a pocket watch. The law makes no distinction when the human being is a dependent female under the guardianship of her brother," Magistrate Crouch intoned, adjusting his spectacles. "Miss Vance is the legal ward of the Viscount. She was pledged as security against a loan. If the loan is repaid, the security must be returned to the guardian. To refuse is theft, Your Grace. It is kidnapping." Gideon stiffened. He looked at Rupert. "You have the money? £30,000. "I do," Rupert said, puffing out his chest. He reached into his coat and pulled out a bank draft. He waved it in the air. £30,000, drawn on the private bank of Baron Finch. It is all there, plus 5% interest as per the law. Gideon looked from the draft to Finch. It was a trap, a perfect, circular trap. Finch had given Rupert the money, loaned it, likely under terms that effectively enslaved Rupert for life, just so Rupert could pay Gideon and reclaim Helena. Once Helena was back in Rupert's custody, Rupert would hand her over to Finch to settle his new debt. "You accepted a loan from him?" Gideon asked Rupert, incredulous. "You sold your sister to me to pay him, and now you borrow from him to buy her back. Do you have no soul, man? Do you not understand what he wants with her?" "Mr. Finch has been very generous," Rupert said, reciting lines that had clearly been rehearsed. "He has offered to forgive the new loan entirely, provided I consent to certain family arrangements. Helena is to be his wife, Rothmore, a baroness. It is a far better match than being the secretary of a bachelor duke." "I will not go," Helena said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. She stepped out from behind Gideon, her face pale, but her eyes burning. She looked at her brother with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I will not go with you, Rupert. You forfeited your right to be my guardian the night you bet me on a hand of cards. You have no choice, Helena." Rupert snapped, his facade of confidence cracking. You are a woman. You are a minor in the eyes of the estate law until you are married or I die. I am the head of the family. I say where you go, and you are coming with me. She stays. Gideon rumbled. He took a step toward the magistrate. I refuse the payment. The debt stands. You cannot refuse, Magistrate Crouch said, opening his portfolio and producing a document. This is a writ of habeas corpus, Your Grace. It demands the release of Miss Helena Vance into the custody of her brother. If you refuse the repayment, you are legally admitting to holding her against the will of her guardian for illicit purposes. I will be forced to summon the constable and have you arrested for abduction. Gideon stared at the writ. It was watertight. He knew the law. He had sat in the House of Lords and debated these very statutes. The patriarchy he helped uphold was now a weapon at his throat. If he refused the money, he was a criminal. If he accepted the money, he lost Helena. Finch stepped closer to Gideon, lowering his voice so only the Duke and Helena could hear. Checkmate, Rothmore. You thought you could buy her with your fortune. I have a fortune too. But I also have the brother. You have nothing but a piece of paper that just became worthless. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. He calculated the distance to Finch's throat. It would be so easy to crush the life out of him. But that would only leave Helena alone, with Gideon hanging from a gallows. He needed a way out. He needed a miracle. He looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 3 o'clock. The courier. He had been expecting a package from London all week. His investigators had been tracking the witnesses to Finch's fraud. The other men he had cheated, the card sharp he had employed to mark the deck at the Crimson Rook. If that package arrived, he could prove the original debt was fraudulent. If the debt was fraud, the contract was void, and the right of redemption did not apply because there was nothing to redeem. But the courier had not arrived. Well, Finch demanded, holding out his hand for the release papers. Do we conclude this business, or do I ask Mr. Crouch to fetch the irons? Gideon's mind raced. He needed time. He couldn't fight the law with force, but he could fight it with bureaucracy. The sum is substantial, Gideon said, his voice flat and controlled. And the draft is drawn on a private bank. I cannot release a £30,000 lien without verifying the funds. The funds are good, Finch shouted. I will be the judge of that, Gideon replied coolly. My solicitor will need to inspect the draft, and I will need to draw up a formal release of the collateral. I will not hand over a gentlewoman like a sack of grain without the proper legal discharge. It would leave me liable for future claims. We can wait, Rupert said eagerly, looking at the brandy decanter on the side table. It will take time, Gideon said. I need to draft the documents. I need to inspect the currency. You have 1 hour, Magistrate Crouch said, checking his pocket watch. The writ is immediate, Your Grace. I am granting you a courtesy because of your rank. But if Miss Vance is not in this carriage by 4 o'clock, I will execute the warrant for your arrest. 1 hour, Gideon agreed. Bennett, show these gentlemen to the drawing room. Give them nothing to drink. But, Rupert protested. Nothing, Gideon barked. Bennett, looking as if he might faint with relief at the temporary reprieve, opened the door. This way, my lords. Sir. Finch narrowed his eyes at Gideon. He suspected a trick, but he was so confident in his legal victory that he didn't care. 1 hour, Rothmore. Say your goodbyes. The girl belongs to me. He waddled out, followed by the magistrate and a reluctant Rupert. The door clicked shut, leaving Gideon and Helena alone in the silence of the library. The moment they were gone, the strength seemed to leave Helena's legs. She sank into the nearest chair, covering her face with her hands. He sold me again, she whispered, her voice muffled by her palms. He borrowed money to buy me back just to sell me again. There is no end to it. I am cursed. Gideon crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her chair. He pulled her hands away from her face, gripping them tightly. Look at me, he commanded. Helena, look at me. She raised her eyes. They were swimming with tears, filled with a despair so profound it tore at his soul. It is over, she said. The law is with them. You heard the magistrate. If you keep me, they will put you in prison. They will not, Gideon said fiercely. I asked for an hour for a reason. To write a letter, to check a bank draft. She shook her head. It doesn't matter if the money is real, Gideon. The law says I belong to Rupert. I am waiting for a package, Gideon said, speaking rapidly. From London. My agents found the man who marked the cards that night. They found the other investors Finch defrauded. I am expecting the affidavits today. If I have proof that the original game was a cheat, the debt is annulled. It never existed. If there is no debt, there is no redemption. Rupert has no claim, and Finch goes to jail. And if the package does not come? Helena asked, staring at the clock. The minute hand seemed to be moving with malicious speed. It is 3:15. The mail coach passed the village at noon. If it were here, Bennett would have brought it. Gideon fell silent. He knew she was right. The courier was late, or the proofs hadn't been found in time. He was gambling again, just like Rupert, betting everything on a card that hadn't turned. I will not let you go with them, Gideon vowed. I will burn this house down before I let Finch touch you. And then what? Helena touched his cheek, her fingers trembling. You go to Newgate. You lose your title, your lands. No, Gideon, I will not let you destroy yourself for me. You are worth my fortune, he said, echoing the words he had spoken to Finch months ago. But now they carried the weight of love, not just honour. You are worth everything. I am a liability, she said, pulling her hands away. She stood up, walking to the window. She looked out at the garden she had helped restore. I should never have come here. I allowed myself to believe, to pretend. Pretend what? Gideon stood up behind her. That I could be free, she whispered. That I could be yours. Gideon wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and fear. You are mine, Helena, in every way that matters. The law is a construct of men. It cannot touch what is between us. The law can put chains on my wrists and force me into Finch's bed, she said brutally. We have 40 minutes, Gideon. Unless your miracle rides through those gates, I have to go. No. Yes, she turned in his arms, gripping his lapels. If I go willingly, they have no cause to arrest you. I can run away later. I can find a way. You will never escape Finch once you are in his house, Gideon said. He will break you. I know men like him. He wants to possess you to punish you for being beyond his reach. He pulled away from her, pacing the room like a caged tiger. There must be another way. A legal precedent. Something. He went to the bookshelves, pulling down heavy volumes of statute law, flipping through pages with frantic haste. Blackstone's commentaries. The rights of persons. Guardianship. He read rapidly, his eyes scanning for a loophole, a clause, anything that could override the rights of a male guardian. But the words on the page were unyielding. The father, and in his absence, the eldest brother, retains dominion over the unmarried female. Dominion. As if she were cattle. It is useless. Gideon slammed the book shut, dust flying into the air. The law was written by men to protect men. Then we must step outside the law, Helena said. Let me leave through the servants' entrance. Give me a horse. I can be in the next county before they realize I am gone. And go where? Gideon asked. You have no money, no connections. You would be a fugitive. Finch would hunt you down, and the magistrate would still arrest me for aiding your escape. Then what do we do? She cried, her composure finally shattering. Do we just watch the clock tick down to my execution? Gideon looked at her, at the woman who had challenged him, saved him, and loved him in silence. He made a decision. It was dangerous, reckless, and terrified him more than the war ever had. Bennett! He roared. The door opened instantly. Bennett had clearly been listening at the keyhole. Your Grace? Send a rider to the crossroads, Gideon ordered. The courier from London. If he is on the road, I want him brought here at a gallop. If he has to kill the horse, get him here. Yes, Your Grace. Bennett vanished. And now, Gideon turned to Helena. We wait. And while we wait, I am going to do what I should have done the night of the dinner. He walked over to her, grabbed her waist, and pulled her flush against him. Before she could protest, before she could remind him of the debt or the danger, he crushed his mouth to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of fury, and of overwhelming love. It was a claim. He kissed her as if he could imprint his soul onto hers, marking her so deeply that Finch would never be able to touch her without burning. Helena made a sound in her throat, a sob of relief, and threw her arms around his neck. She opened to him, kissing him back with equal ferocity. For weeks, they had danced around this fire, terrified of the burn. Now, with the executioner at the door, they threw themselves into the flames. Gideon lifted her, sitting her on the edge of the heavy oak desk, scattering papers and quills. He stepped between her legs, his hands tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you, Helena. And I swear by everything I hold sacred, you will not leave this house with him. I love you," she sobbed. "Gideon, I'm scared." "I know." He held her face in his hands, resting his forehead against hers. "I am too." The clock on the mantel chimed the half hour. 30 minutes left. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the window panes. In the drawing room, Finch checked his watch and smiled, visualizing the victory to come. In the library, two lovers clung to each other, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal salvation, or the silence that would mean the end of everything. Gideon looked over Helena's shoulder at the window. The driveway was empty. The road to the south was empty. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a pistol. He checked the prime and placed it on the desk, covering it with a ledger. "What are you doing?" Helena asked, her eyes widening. "If the courier does not come," Gideon said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I will not let them take you. I will offer them a choice. They leave, or I create a widow of the Baroness Finch before she is even wed." "Gideon, no," Helena gasped. "That is murder. You will hang." "Then I hang," he said, taking her hand and kissing the palm. "But you will be free." They waited. The minutes ticked by like drops of blood. 3:40, 3:45, 3:50. At 3:55, the door handle turned. "Time is up, Your Grace," Finch's voice called from the hallway. Gideon looked at Helena. He looked at the pistol. He looked at the empty driveway. "Stay behind me," he said. England, 1823. The silence in the library of Holloway Hall was not empty. It was a living, suffocating thing, heavy with the scent of ozone from the approaching storm and the metallic tang of imminent violence. Gideon Althorpe stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his body a barrier between the woman he loved and the men who sought to enslave her. The pistol lay on the desk, a cold promise of ruin, covered only by a thin ledger. Across the room, Baron Oswald Finch checked his pocket watch with a theatrical sigh, the gold casing clicking shut like the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. "Time is up, Your Grace," Finch repeated, his voice dripping with a faux regret that masked his predatory glee. "The hour has struck. The law is clear. Surrender the girl, or surrender your freedom." Magistrate Crouch stepped forward, his face pinched and pale, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but bound by the statutes he served. He cleared his throat, a dry, dusty sound. "Your Grace," he began, his voice wavering slightly as he looked at the Duke's clenched fists. "I have no desire to create a spectacle. You are a peer of the realm, but the writ of habeas corpus is absolute. You are detaining Miss Vance against the wishes of her legal guardian. If you do not step aside, I shall be forced to summon the constables waiting at the gate." Gideon did not move. He could feel Helena's breath against his back, rapid and shallow. He could feel the trembling of her hands where she gripped his coat. He calculated the odds. If he picked up the pistol, he ended his life as a duke and began his life as a fugitive or a corpse. If he stepped aside, he ended Helena's life as a free woman. It was an impossible choice, a checkmate engineered by a man with no soul. "I do not recognize the authority of a guardian who sold his ward for a stack of chips," Gideon said, his voice low and vibrating with suppressed rage. "The law does not concern itself with morality, Your Grace. Only with property rights," Finch sneered. "And she is property. My property, by way of her brother. Now move." Finch took a step forward, reaching out as if to shove the Duke aside. Gideon's hand twitched toward the desk. Helena gasped. At that precise moment, the library doors groaned. They did not open with the usual deferential silence of the household staff. They were thrown open with a force that banged the heavy oak against the panelling. Bennet stood in the threshold. The elderly butler was gasping for air, his usually immaculate livery splashed with mud, his chest heaving. He looked wild, stripped of his dignity by urgency. In his shaking hand, he clutched a leather dispatch pouch, dark with rain and sealed with red wax. "The courier," Bennet wheezed, stumbling into the room. "He rode the horse to death, your grace. But he is here." The room froze. Finch looked at the pouch, and for the first time, the smug certainty slipped from his face, replaced by a flicker of true fear. Gideon wasted no time. He strode across the room, ignoring the magistrate, and snatched the pouch from Bennet's hands. He broke the seal with a violent snap. His fingers, usually so precise, tore at the parchment. He pulled out a sheaf of documents, affidavits, sworn testimonies, and a diagram of a card table. He scanned them rapidly, his eyes devouring the words. As he read, the tension in his shoulders broke, replaced by a terrifying cold calm. A smile, sharp as a razor, touched his lips. He turned slowly to face the room. "Magistrate Crouch," Gideon said, his voice ringing with a new authority. "You spoke of the law. You spoke of the sanctity of contracts and the right of redemption." "I did, your grace," Crouch said, eyeing the papers nervously. "And you are aware, as a man of the court, of the principle of fraud vitiates everything?" Gideon asked, walking toward the desk. "Fraud destroys the validity of a contract. If the original debt was created through criminal deception, then the debt does not exist. If the debt does not exist, it cannot be bought, it cannot be sold, and it certainly cannot be redeemed." "What is this nonsense?" Finch blustered, though he had taken a step back toward the door. "The game was fair." "Was it?" Gideon asked softly. He slammed the papers down onto the desk, right next to the hidden pistol. "This," Gideon announced, placing his hand on the stack, "is a sworn affidavit from a Mr. Silas Vane, a man currently in custody in London. You might know him, Finch. He was the dealer at your table the night Lord Vance lost everything. Finch went the colour of old parchment. Mr. Vane has confessed, under oath and before a King's Bench judge, that he was in your employ." Gideon continued, his voice relentless. He details how he used a mechanic's grip to deal from the bottom of the deck. He details how you signalled him by adjusting your signet ring. And most damning of all, he has provided the marked deck itself to the authorities. A deck where the aces were shaved by a fraction of an inch. "Lies!" Finch screamed, his voice cracking. "A criminal's lies. Corroborated by 3 other gentlemen you fleeced in the same week," Gideon interrupted, his tone icy. "And by the club owner, who was all too happy to turn King's evidence to save his own neck." Gideon picked up the document and thrust it toward the magistrate. "Read it, Crouch. The original wager was a fraud. Lord Vance did not lose his sister. He was robbed. Therefore, the debt of £30,000 I purchased was based on a criminal act. It is null and void. I owe Finch nothing. Rupert owes Finch nothing. And Miss Vance is not collateral. She is a free woman who has been held hostage by a thief." The magistrate took the papers with trembling hands. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and the ragged breathing of Rupert Vance, who was staring at Gideon with wide, uncomprehending eyes. As Crouch read, his expression shifted from bureaucratic annoyance to shock and finally to professional outrage. He looked up at Finch, his demeanour hardening. "This affidavit is signed by Justice Thornton," Crouch said, his voice grave. "It includes a warrant for the arrest of Baron Oswald Finch for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." "What?" Finch gasped, looking around for an escape route. "That is impossible. I have friends. I have influence." "You have a warrant," Crouch said, folding the paper. He turned to the door. "Bennet, summon the constables." "No!" Finch lunged. Not at Gideon, but at the papers in the magistrate's hand, intending to tear them. Gideon moved faster. He caught Finch by the lapels of his purple coat and slammed him back against the bookshelves. Books tumbled down, crashing around them. Gideon held the Baron pinned, his face inches from the man's sweating forehead. "I should kill you," Gideon whispered, the darkness in his voice making Finch whimper, "for what you tried to do to her, for the terror you caused. I should break your neck right here." "Please," Finch gurgled, clawing at Gideon's iron grip. "But she is watching," Gideon said, looking past Finch to where Helena stood, frozen by the fireplace. "And I will not stain her freedom with your blood. You are not worth the hangman's rope, Oswald, but you will rot in prison." He threw Finch to the floor, just as two burly village constables, summoned by the quick-thinking Bennett, burst into the room. "Take him," Magistrate Crouch ordered, pointing at the grovelling Baron. As the constables hauled the screaming Finch away, his protests echoing down the marble hallway, the atmosphere in the library shifted. The threat was gone. The monster had been slain. But the wound remained. Rupert Vance stood in the centre of the room, looking at the empty doorway where Finch had vanished. He looked at Gideon, then at Helena. A slow, tentative smile spread across his face. He smoothed his velvet coat, his confidence returning with terrifying speed now that his debt was erased. "Well," Rupert said, letting out a breathless laugh, "that was close. A masterstroke, Rothmore. Truly. You saved us both a great deal of trouble." Gideon turned to look at the young Viscount. His expression was not one of relief, but of utter, consuming disgust. "I did not save you," Gideon said quietly. "I saved her." Of course," Rupert said, waving his hand dismissively. "But it amounts to the same thing. The debt is gone. The slate is clean. I am free of Finch, and Helena, well, Helena is free to come home." "Home?" Helena spoke for the first time. Her voice was hollow, sounding as if it came from a great distance. She had not moved from the fireplace. She looked at her brother as if he were a stranger she was meeting for the first time. "Yes, home," Rupert said, adopting a tone of brotherly authority. "Come now, Helena, get your things. We shall return to London. We can pretend this entire sordid affair never happened. I am sure with the Duke's influence we can hush up the scandal. You can still make a match, perhaps with a widower or a country squire." "You sold me," Helena whispered. Rupert flushed. "That was a misunderstanding. I was desperate. You know how it is. You borrowed money from the man who threatened to rape me, just to buy me back," Helena continued, her voice rising, trembling with the force of her realization. "You brought him here. You were going to hand me over to him." "I had to," Rupert snapped, his patience fraying. "It was the only way to clear the ledger. And frankly, Helena, you should be grateful. Finch was willing to marry you. Do you think offers like that grow on trees for a spinster of 25 with no dowry?" Gideon took a step forward, his hand raising to strike, but Helena stepped between them. She looked at her brother, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a victim of vice, but as a man who viewed her existence solely as a resource to be consumed. "You would have done it anyway," she said. "It wasn't just the cards, was it? Even if you had won that hand, you would have sold me eventually." Rupert looked at her, his lip curling in a sneer of petulant honesty. "Of course I would have," he spat. "What else are you for? You drain the estate's accounts. You nag me about the rents. You sit in that house like a ghost of our father, judging me. Finch offered £20,000 weeks ago. The card game was just an acceleration. I needed the money, Helena. I have debts you don't even know about. Did you think I was going to support you forever? You are a burden, a millstone around my neck." The silence that followed was more violent than any scream. Helena recoiled as if he had slapped her. The truth hung naked in the air. She had never been a sister to him. She had been a savings account, waiting to be liquidated. Gideon roared. It was a sound of pure, animal fury. He grabbed Rupert by the collar and dragged him toward the door. "Get out!" Gideon bellowed. "Get off my land!" Rupert struggled, his feet skidding on the rug. "You can't treat me like this. I'm a peer. She is my sister. She belongs to me. She belongs to no one, Gideon shouted, throwing Rupert into the hallway so hard the younger man fell sprawling onto the marble. Gideon stood in the doorway, chest heaving, pointing a shaking finger at the Viscount. "If you ever come within 10 miles of her again," Gideon promised, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "I will not use the law. I will hunt you down like a fox, and I will leave you for the crows. Go to the continent. Go to hell, but do not ever speak her name again." Rupert scrambled to his feet, looking from the Duke to his sister. He saw the murder in Gideon's eyes. He turned and ran, fleeing the house without looking back, a coward to the end. Gideon slammed the door shut. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, sealing the room. He turned back to Helena. He expected to see relief. He expected to see her crying, perhaps, or fainting from the shock. He was ready to hold her, to tell her it was over, that she was safe, that the nightmare was finished. But Helena was not crying. She was standing by the desk, staring at the papers, the affidavit of fraud. She looked at the pistol. She looked at the ledger where she had worked for months. "Helena?" Gideon said softly, walking toward her. "It's done. They are gone." Helena looked up. Her brown eyes were dry and agonizingly empty. She looked at him, and then she looked around the opulent library. "It's done," she repeated dully. "The transaction is cancelled." "What?" Gideon stopped, confused. "The fraud annulled the debt," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "The contract is void. That means the purchase never happened." "Yes," Gideon said, reaching for her hand. "Which means you are free. The writ is gone. You are safe." "Safe," she whispered. She pulled her hand away before he could touch her. Gideon felt a chill of dread. "Helena, what is wrong?" "Do you know what I felt, Gideon, while you were arguing with Finch?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I stood there, and I listened to 3 men discuss my price. Finch had a price. Rupert had a price. And you had a price too. I paid it to save you," Gideon said, desperate to make her understand. "You bought a debt," she corrected him. "You bought a claim. And just now, you threw my brother out not because he hurt me, but because he challenged your ownership." "That is not true," Gideon protested, hurt flashing in his eyes. "I love you." "Do you?" she asked. "Or do you love the fact that you saved me? Do you love the fact that I am the one thing in this house that you earned?" "Helena, stop," Gideon pleaded. "You are in shock." Rupert's words, they were poison. "Don't let them poison us." "Us?" She laughed, a brittle breaking sound. "There is no us, Gideon. There is a duke, and there is a piece of collateral. Even now you are holding the proof that the transaction was void, as if that is what matters. As if my freedom is something that can be granted by a piece of paper signed by a judge." She backed away from him, moving toward the servant's door concealed in the panelling. "Where are you going?" Gideon asked, panic rising in his chest. "I need to breathe," she said. I need to not be here. I need to not be the woman who was won in a poker game." "Helena, wait!" Gideon lunged for her, but the desk was between them. She opened the door and slipped into the darkness of the service corridor. Gideon scrambled over the obstacle, running to the door. "Helena!" he shouted into the gloom. But she was gone. The narrow passage twisted toward the kitchens and the rear exits. Gideon ran into the hallway, shouting for Bennett, for Mrs. Gable, for anyone. The house was in chaos. The constables were still dragging Finch's carriage away. The servants were clustered in the main hall, whispering about the fight. No one noticed the slip of a girl in a grey dress running through the rain toward the stables. Helena ran until her lungs burned. The rain was torrential now, soaking her instantly, plastering the silk dress to her skin. She didn't feel the cold. She felt only a burning need to escape Rupert's cruelty, Finch's lust, and yes, even Gideon's overwhelming, suffocating protection. She felt dirty. She felt like an object that had been passed from hand to hand until it had lost all human shape. She is a burden, a millstone. Rupert's words echoed in her mind. She is worth my fortune. Gideon's voice countered. Value, price, cost. It was all they saw. No one saw her. She reached the stables, pushing open the heavy door. The smell of hay and horses was a comfort, a memory of a time before London, before the gambling, before she became a currency. The stable boy was gone, hiding from the commotion at the main house. Helena moved to the stall of the mare she had ridden occasionally. Her hands shook as she grabbed a bridle. She didn't bother with a saddle. It would take too long, and the girths were heavy. She forced the bit into the mare's mouth and led the horse out into the aisle. She used a mounting block to scramble onto the horse's back, her wet skirts tangling around her legs. She gripped the mane, feeling the animal's warmth beneath her. She didn't know where she was going. She had no money, no cloak, no plan. She only knew she could not stay in Holloway Hall another minute. She could not sleep in the bed provided by the man who bought her, eating the food paid for by his charity. She had to be free. Even if freedom meant dying in the cold. She kicked the mare's flanks. The horse, sensing her agitation, bolted forward. They burst out of the stable doors and into the storm. Gideon reached the front steps just in time to see a flash of grey and the dark shape of a horse galloping toward the gate. "Helena!" he screamed, his voice torn away by the wind. She did not look back. She bent low over the horse's neck, urging it faster, disappearing into the wall of rain and darkness. Gideon stood in the mud, the rain mingling with the tears on his face. He had won the legal battle. He had destroyed his enemies. He had cleared the debt, but in his arrogance, in his focus on the contract and the conflict, he had failed to see the woman breaking apart before his eyes. He turned back to the house, shouting for his own horse. "Saddle Ares! Now!" he roared at a terrified groom who had just emerged. He would not let her go. He would chase her to the ends of the earth, not to claim her, not to own her, but to beg her forgiveness for making her feel like something that could be bought. England, 1823. The storm that battered the moors of Derbyshire was not merely a weather event. It was a physical manifestation of the chaos that had consumed the lives of the two riders tearing through the darkness. The wind howled like a banshee, stripping the leaves from the ancient oaks and turning the road into a churning river of mud. Gideon Althorpe, Duke of Rothmore, rode with a desperation that bordered on madness. His stallion, Ares, was a beast of war, bred for stamina and courage, but even he struggled against the gale, his hooves slipping on the treacherous slate of the path. Gideon did not feel the biting cold of the rain that soaked through his heavy riding coat. He felt only the icy terror gripping his heart. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. He had treated Helena Vance as a problem to be solved, a legal equation to be balanced. He had fought for her possession, for her safety, for her honour, but he had failed to fight for her dignity. He had let her believe, even for a moment, that she was nothing more than a prize won in a contest of wills between men. "She is worth my fortune." The words mocked him now. What good was a fortune if the woman who gave it meaning was lost in the night, fleeing from him as if he were the monster? He knew the road she must have taken. There was only one path that a rider without a saddle could navigate in this darkness, the old trade road leading toward the village of Matlock. It was a treacherous route, lined with steep drops and dense woods. If her mare stumbled, Gideon pushed the thought away, urging Ares faster. He scanned the gloom, his navy blue eyes straining against the stinging rain. Ahead, a faint, flickering light cut through the black curtain of the storm. It was the coaching inn, the drover's rest, a squat, timber-framed building that sat at the crossroads like a beacon for lost souls. Gideon's heart leaped. She would have to stop. No horse could continue in this weather without rest, and Helena, for all her courage, was freezing and exhausted. He thundered into the inn's courtyard, pulling Ares to a halt amidst a spray of mud. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the mire. He did not bother to tether the horse. The animal was too spent to run. Gideon slammed his shoulder against the heavy oak door of the inn and burst inside. The common room was warm, smelling of roasted onions, stale ale, and damp wool. A few travellers, huddled by the hearth, looked up in alarm as the Duke of Rothmore entered, looking like a vengeful spirit rising from the bog. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, pooling on the floorboards. His face was pale, his expression terrifying. "Where is she?" Gideon demanded, his voice raspy. The innkeeper, a burly man named Higgins, stood behind the bar, wiping a tankard. He blinked, recognizing the crest on the buttons of Gideon's soaked coat. "Your Grace," Higgins stammered. We didn't expect—" "A woman," Gideon interrupted, stepping forward. "Blonde, riding a grey mare. Alone." Higgins swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the private parlour door at the back of the room. "She just arrived, Your Grace. Shivering like a leaf she was. Said she had no coin, but offered a silver hairpin. I put her by the fire in the back. I was going to bring her some broth." Gideon reached into his pocket, pulled out a gold sovereign, and slammed it onto the counter. "Keep the broth coming, and leave us!" He did not wait for an answer. He strode across the room, the other patrons shrinking back to let him pass. He reached the parlour door and hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the latch. He was the Duke of Rothmore, a man who commanded the fate of thousands, yet he was terrified of what he would find on the other side. He took a breath, steeling himself, and opened the door. The room was small, lit only by the dying embers of a peat fire. Helena sat on a low stool close to the hearth, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket the innkeeper must have lent her. Her wet dress clung to her skin, the silk ruined. Her hair, usually so neat, hung in damp, tangled strands around her face. She looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. She did not look up as he entered. She stared into the fire, her hands trembling as she held them out to the weak heat. "Helena." He spoke her name softly, afraid that a louder sound might shatter her. She flinched, her shoulders hunching defensively. She turned her head slowly. Her brown eyes were rimmed with red, dull and exhausted. There was no anger in them, only a profound resignation that hurt him more than any scream. "You found me," she whispered. "Of course you did. You own the land. You own the road. You own the horse. I do not own you," Gideon said, closing the door behind him to shut out the noise of the tavern. He walked toward her, but he did not try to touch her. He stopped a few feet away, water dripping from his coat onto the hearthstones, sizzling as it hit the heat. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the damage his protection had caused. He saw a woman who had been stripped of her agency, passed from a brother who saw her as currency, to a fiancé who saw her as prey, and finally to a saviour who had inadvertently become her jailer. "I am not going back, Gideon," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I cannot sleep in that house another night knowing that I am there because of a contract. I would rather sleep in a ditch." "You are not going back as collateral," Gideon said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The leather wallet was damp, but the contents were safe. He pulled out a folded document. It was the original deed of debt, the piece of paper Rupert had signed at the Crimson Rook, the paper Gideon had bought for £30,000, the paper that had defined Helena's existence for months. Helena watched him, wary. "What is that?" "The chain," Gideon said. He knelt by the fire. He did not look at her. He looked at the flames. With a deliberate, steady hand, he thrust the document into the heart of the fire. "No!" Helena gasped, half rising. "That is £30,000. That is your proof." "Watch it burn," Gideon commanded softly. They watched in silence as the parchment curled. The edges turned black, the ink bubbling for a second before vanishing into ash. The wax seal, the symbol of the debt's legality, melted into a red puddle and was consumed. In seconds, the document that had enslaved her was gone, reduced to nothing but grey flakes rising up the chimney. Gideon stood up. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a heavy velvet pouch. He placed it on the rough wooden table between them. It landed with the heavy thud of gold. "There is £500 in that bag," Gideon said, his voice steady. "It is not a gift. It is your wages. You managed my estate for months. You saved me thousands in wool sales alone. You earned this, Helena. Every penny." Helena stared at the bag, then at the ashes in the fireplace, then up at his face. She was confused, her mind struggling to process the shift. Why? She asked. Because you were right, Gideon said. He took off his wet hat and ran a hand through his rain-slicked black hair. I thought I was saving you, but I was only buying the right to control you. I fought Finch. I fought your brother. I fought the law. But I never gave you the one thing you actually needed. And what is that? She whispered. The choice to leave, Gideon replied. He stepped back, putting distance between them. He gestured toward the door. The debt is gone. The paper is ash. You have your own money now. You are free, Helena. You can take that gold, hire a carriage, and go anywhere in England. You can start a new life. You can open a school, buy a cottage, travel to the continent. No one has a claim on you. Not Rupert, not Finch, and not me. He looked at her with an intensity that burned, his navy eyes stripping away all pretenses. I love you, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this wretched, lonely life. But love is not possession. If you stay with me, it must be because you choose to, not because you have nowhere else to go. So I am giving you the means to go. He waited. The silence in the room was deafening. The fire crackled. The wind battered the shutters. Helena looked at the bag of gold, the symbol of independence she had craved for years. She looked at the door, the path to a life where she answered to no one. Then she looked at Gideon. She saw a man who was stripped of his armour. The arrogant duke was gone. In his place stood a man soaked to the bone, shivering slightly, who had just burned a fortune to give her dignity back. He was terrified. She could see it in the tension of his jaw, in the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He was letting her go, even though it was tearing him apart. Helena stood up. The blanket fell from her shoulders, pooling on the floor. She took a step toward the table. She reached out and touched the velvet bag. £500, she mused. A woman could live comfortably for years on this. Yes, Gideon said, his voice hollow. She looked at him. And if I walk out that door, then I will watch you go, Gideon said. And I will ensure you are safe until you are beyond my reach. And then I will spend the rest of my life missing you. Helena smiled. It was a small, watery smile, but it reached her eyes, lighting them up like lamps in the darkness. You are a terrible businessman, Gideon Althorpe, she said softly. You pay £30,000 for a bad debt, and then you burn the receipt. And now you are trying to pay your best employee to leave. I am not paying you to leave, Gideon rasped. I am paying you to be free. Helena walked around the table. She stopped inches from him. She reached out and took his cold, wet hand in hers. Freedom is not about money, Gideon. It is about who holds your heart. You held mine long before you burned that paper. She squeezed his hand, her gaze fierce and loving. I don't want the money, Gideon. I don't want to go to the continent or open a school. I want to go home. I want to argue with you about the railway bill. I want to fix the roof in the West Wing. I want to wake up every morning and know that I am exactly where I belong. Helena. Gideon breathed, hope dawning in his eyes like a sunrise. I choose you, she whispered. Not because of the debt, not because of the safety, but because you are the only man who ever saw me, not as a spinster or a sister, but as a soul. Gideon made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his soaked chest. He buried his face in her wet hair, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. I thought I had lost you, he murmured against her neck. God, Helena, I thought I had lost you. You almost did, she admitted, clinging to him. But you came for me, and you let me go. That was the only way to keep me. He pulled back slightly, framing her face in his hands. He looked at her, with a reverence that made her knees weak. Marry me, he said, not to satisfy a contract, not to stop a scandal. Marry me because I cannot breathe without you. Marry me and be the mistress of Holloway Hall, not as my ward, but as my equal, my partner. Helena laughed, crying at the same time. Is that a proposal, Your Grace? It lacks a certain formality. You are soaking wet, and we are in a tavern. It is the only proposal you will get, he said, smiling, the old spark returning to his eyes. Unless you want me to kneel in the mud? No, she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. This is perfect. Yes, I will marry you, Gideon. He kissed her then. A deep, slow kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke and infinite promise. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small parlour, the world was calm. They were no longer debtor and creditor, master and servant. They were simply two people who had weathered the hurricane and found safe harbour in each other. Epilogue. 6 months later. Christmas, 1823. Holloway Hall was unrecognisable. The gloom that had once shrouded the estate had been banished, replaced by the warmth of a house that was truly lived in. Holly and ivy decked the banisters of the grand staircase, and the scent of roasting goose and spiced wine filled the air. In the library, the fire roared in the hearth, but the room was no longer a dusty tomb of silence. It was a hive of activity. Gideon sat at his desk, reviewing the final construction reports for the Rothmore railway spur. The bill had passed, the tracks were being laid, and the local economy was booming. He looked healthy, the lines of exhaustion gone from his face, replaced by a contentment that softened his severe features. Across from him, at her own desk, identical in size to his, sat Helena, the Duchess of Rothmore. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson velvet, her honey-blonde hair gleaming in the firelight. She was writing a letter to Mr. Colborne regarding the new school they were building for the tenant workers' children. Gideon put down his pen and watched her. He never tired of watching her. "Helena," he said. She looked up, her pen pausing. "Yes, a letter arrived from the continent today," Gideon said, picking up a piece of parchment. "From Baden-Baden." Helena's expression tightened slightly. "Rupert?" Gideon nodded. "He writes that the waters are good for his health, but the cards have been unkind. He asks for assistance." Helena sighed, but there was no pain in it, only a distant pity. She put down her pen and looked at her husband. "And what did you reply?" "I haven't replied yet," Gideon said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I thought I would defer to the estate manager. After all, the funds are under your supervision." Helena smiled. She picked up her pen again. "Send him nothing," she said decisively. "Or perhaps send him a book on mathematics. He needs to learn the odds." Gideon laughed, a rich, deep sound that filled the room. "Remind me never to cross you, my love. You are ruthless. I am practical," she corrected, her eyes twinkling. "And we have better things to spend our money on." She stood up and walked over to him. Gideon pushed his chair back and pulled her onto his lap, heedless of the propriety Mrs. Gable, who was now completely devoted to Helena, might try to enforce. "We have everything we need," Gideon said, resting his hand on her waist. "Finch is in prison. Rupert is in exile, and the debt is ended." "It ended long ago," Helena whispered, leaning her forehead against his. She looked at the fire, remembering the night the paper had burned. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the terror of the Crimson Rook to the cold carriage ride, from the humiliation of the barn to the triumph of the dinner party. It had been a hard road, paved with fear and pride, but it had led her here, to this warm room and this good man. She touched Gideon's face, tracing the line of his jaw. "We won, Gideon." "Yes," he said, kissing her palm. "We won." Outside, the snow began to fall, covering the moors in a blanket of pristine white. Inside, the fire burned bright and steady, casting two shadows on the wall that merged into one. They were no longer defined by what they owed or what they owned. They were defined by what they had built together, a fortress of love that no debt could ever threaten.